Hello everyone, welcome to Radically Loved Radio. I wanted to create a place where people can go to get inspired, get motivated, or find some clarity and get tools to create a radically loved life. I will do my best to provide information on a variety of subjects, including yoga, holistic health, life coaching, spirituality, meditation, and overall mindful living. Each episode will bring you some of the world's best spiritual leaders, entrepreneurs, yoga teachers, coaches, along with some of my closest friends, and we will talk about their life experiences and journeys to create something more out of their lives and how they continue to grow to make that happen. Hey guys, Rosie here. I just want to say I am so grateful that you're listening. We are just getting a massive amount of response on this podcast, and I am so grateful that you're a part of this radically loved community, that you're enjoying the content and that you're enjoying all the guests and that you're still here and you're still working on yourself and your journey and your path. And I pray that you've received some tools listening to the guests or listening to any of my ideas or topics on meditation or yoga and how these tools can help you create a life of purpose. To continue to help us give you the best content, you can subscribe to this podcast, and most of the time you can just do it from your phone, from iTunes. Click subscribe and write a review. This really helps us continue this path and this journey, and we love doing it so much. And again, I'm so grateful that you're here. Let us know what you thought. Thanks for listening. I'm so excited to have you on the show again, and I've been just waiting to talk to you about your new book, The Dharma of the Princess Bride, and just to kind of talk about all the ways in which it relates, obviously, to our lives, but especially now with the current social and cultural climate, how it can relate even more so just in the way that we live our lives. So thank you for being on.
Thanks for having me back, Rosie. It's great to be here again.
Yay. So, for the people that don't know, just a quick snippet of your background, who you are, and why you wrote this incredible book.
Well, thanks for calling it incredible. So, I'm Ethan Nichtern. I have a title as a senior teacher in the Shambhala tradition, which is a very westernized and globalized form of Tibetan Buddhism in terms of its psychological and spiritual teachings of origin. I grew up in obviously the United States and born in 1978, grew up in the 80s and 90s, and was a big product obviously of pop culture and alternative culture and things like that. And I am also have been asked a lot of times as a teacher and as just working with students, and asked myself how to integrate Buddhist teachings or mindfulness or being a meditation practitioner into personal relationships. And so it's definitely something I wanted to talk about. I got to talk about it a little bit in my last book, The Road Home, but wanted to go deeper. And, the other origin of this book was the real origin of this book was wanting to talk about relationships in a way that didn't require me to come across as a relationship expert. I actually think that term, as I talk about in the book, is an oxymoron because relationship is at least two people. An expert is one person. Which I'm not saying that there aren't great relationship therapists who can help us with our relationships or relationship guides, but the notion of expertise, it seems like we always approach relationships as if somebody must know better how they work. And like there's some expert somewhere who, has a perfect holidays every year with their family, just falls in love perfectly, and everybody feels really good about it. And, all their friends always get along with them and no problems at work. And, that just, even political debates are done with, just like total respect and dignity. And, I don't think that person really exists who can have that expertise, because you're always relating to other people. So I wanted a way to discuss the matter that I didn't have to come across as a relationship expert. And I remembered that right before my first book was published, which was by a small publisher called Wisdom, they had published this book called The Dharma of Star Wars. And more like a manual, like a fun kind of manual if the Jedi Code were analyzed in Buddhist terms. But I remember saying if I ever did something like that, it would be with The Princess Bride. So, using pop culture allowed me to really look at the narratives that our modern spiritual lives are lived by and sort of what we love. And I have a lot of really personal, deep connections to Princess Bride. And it also allowed me to sort of create a very personal and playful narrative set against talking about relationships, So friendship, romance, and family are the three sections of the book. So, my two favorite chapter titles, there's one chapter in the romance section called There Is No Buttercup. But my very favorite chapter title in this book is Fred Savage is a Jerk, and I am Fred Savage, because I was literally almost exactly the same age as Fred Savage when the movie came out. So the notion of a spoiled grandson being read this amazing deconstructed fairy tale by his grandfather felt very personal too. But he is a jerk to his grandfather at the beginning of the movie, at least.
How is it that you related to that? And look, I mean, for the people that read it, you really disclose a lot of your personal relationship, and I know that your father's also a very prevalent, well-known teacher, which I've taken some of his courses, by the way, online, and he's amazing. Your dad's I think he's so hilarious. And so wise, and this is part of you growing up, and you've been in this world your entire life. And I know that there's a relationship to Christopher Guest, right? He was a friend of your father's, and so I really like how you interweave your own personal stories into the mindfulness of relationships, really, which is what this book is about. How is it that? So I know you talk about this, but which character do you resonate with the most, and why?
Yeah, that's all are great questions. I mean, so the origin of this is, it came out in fall of 1987, so a little over 30 years ago now. The book was released to kind of coincide with the 30th anniversary. And when I went back to say, what was actually going on in my life, so the reason I saw this movie, I had never read the book, which was supposedly very popular among people in Hollywood, but they never thought they could turn it into a good movie until Rob Reiner got the rights to it, and he had so many successes in his recent movies that they let him do it. But people my age didn't really know about the book very much. So this movie was what is this, a fairy tale? And the reason I saw it was because my father's one of his best friends, and his best friend from childhood, the actor Christopher Guest, played one of the bad guys in it, the six-fingered man, Count Rugen. So it was, but when I went back, I remembered and I remember talking to my mother about this, because I was what actually was going on? I remember it being a rough time, but that year was the year that my parents' Buddhist teacher, who was a real central figure in their life, Chogyam Trungpa, died, and I think by all estimations died really young. He was in his late 40s, and I think his students weren't really prepared for that. And this was a year I was having a hard time in school. This was the year my two Buddhist parents, went through a very difficult divorce. And this was the year my own grandfather and his wife, my step-grandmother, committed suicide together because he had advanced stage Parkinson's, and they sort of wanted to end things painlessly rather than having a long, debilitating stretch. So so much stuff going on that was related to family relationships and my family's spiritual heritage. And so to set that against this sort of really hilarious fairy tale, but it's also, the message of The Princess Bride is actually that life isn't a fairy tale. There's never been a movie that did such a good job of deconstructing a genre, kind of undercutting all these sort of very sort of cliched and sugary ways that we look to fairy tales or rom-coms for happiness. But it still is incredibly celebratory of life. So it's like, it's very rare that you have something that completely makes fun of its own genre and celebrates it at the same time. So it felt, I mean, even though it's not a Buddhist movie, when it came into my life, my personal connections with it, and also that it's all about relationships. I mean, it's got great friendships. It's got great family, grandfather, grandson dynamic. It's got, this really amazing non-fairy tale, but totally fairy tale romance. It seemed just like a perfect palette to be personal about relationships. And, that's the other thing I really feel and felt. The other theme is like, really, if you are going to be a person who's helping others or guiding others or offering insights to others about the spiritual path, and, especially a very psychologically oriented spiritual path, I think it's really helpful to be open, maybe not exhibitionist, but at least open about your own process. And because otherwise I've noticed this a lot. People put teachers on a pedestal, and that doesn't really help because it separates the teacher from the student. Then the teacher oftentimes pretends that their consciousness is completely pure around relationship issues, and then it turns out that they have problems relating to people, and then that's a huge sort of it breaks away at the foundation of the teacher's credibility, and I think especially in this era, 2017, when there's so much coming out about power dynamics, hierarchies, there've been some scandals in the Buddhist world, some scandals in the yoga world recently. It's just really important to be open about talking about these things. And I do think that the teachers that we look to can be people that we think have some insights into this process, but as soon as we think they're not also on a path themselves, it seems to become really harmful, that lack of transparency and that lack of openness. And then we start expecting things that aren't really appropriate. And, rather than purity, I really think, especially with all the things going on right now in the world and in power hierarchies, especially with, straight white males, and not just straight white males, but mostly that, being observed as, being either erratic or straight up abusive in their behavior. I think it's really important to just lay these things out so that we are kind of, we don't have to develop perfect action. We just have to develop some kind of humility, some kind of emotional curiosity, some kind of empathy towards ourselves and others. And so that desire for transparency and also to be playful, gives the book a little bit of a memoir quality. And, I'm very careful to say that, pretty much everybody I mentioned in the book knew I was writing about them or has written publicly themselves.
Right. I want to just everything that you're saying. I love that you're really talking about this, because I think it's such a big topic right now. And I know that you're very obviously socially active in the way that you bring these Buddhist teachings to your community and to the world. And I'm always following you on social media, and I always love how, to me, and just maybe it's because I know your voice and I know how you teach and how you write. I think I can understand that, and I think you've talked about this before, how pop culture has become our spiritual text, and the way that we really can begin to relate to mindfulness or teachings that are meant to allow us to see more empathy or see the interconnectedness between each other. And I think that just you're speaking to that. And what I'd like to know is just to stay on the topic that you're talking about, how we can begin to create that within our own lives and within the community at large, especially when we're seeing so much injustice in a lot of different ways,
Yeah, I mean, I also think, I'll just take full responsibility for my views on the topic, because I am a progressive political thinker. I think that's where my Buddhist practice and also, my yoga practice, when my baby daughter lets me have a few minutes of asana practice in the morning. I still get my meditation in every day, but But my asana practice is a little bit embarrassing these days with excuses. But anyway, back to the point. I feel like these practices have led me deeper into being a progressive political thinker. I think we have to I think it's a little too enabling to say that these teachings don't lead towards at least a deep contemplation of our interdependence and our political views. And I do think that, so I'll take ownership of that, but I think one of the worst things about the Trump era, which is hopefully going to be over in the not too distant future, there are signs that that more people are sick of it.
Right.
But one of the things that represents, that I always saw in Trump, because we've had him in New York for 40 years, and then you have people like him, who you could argue, if you want to be egalitarian about this, are on both sides of the political party spectrum, when you bring in somebody like Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah.
But what Trump really said to his followers, and mostly empowered white males, is if somebody tells you that you have to grow or become more mature or listen to them more or become more generous or more humble, or more thoughtful, all of that is crap. You do not have to be on any path. You can just claim your power. You can just pretend whatever you want to be true is true. Just lie. If somebody asks you a question, just lie about it. And if you can hold to the lie, which is clearly what he does almost every time he's asked about anything, you will hold on to your power. And so the notion of actually people who are in power, and my power, other than being a straight white male in our society, is that I'm a teacher in certain ways. I'm also a student, for sure. And there's also many people in my life I have nothing to teach, and they don't regard me that way. But in this way the work that I do, there's a power of saying, we're going on this path together, and I may have some insights or some guidance. Mm-hmm. And those people have to get more humble and have to get more empathetic and have to, I'm doing most of the talking right now, which maybe I should stop, but have to get better at listening to what's really going on with others. And get more invested in the truth rather than let's just have a PR spin on whatever we want it to be. What is actually happening here? You're part of the world's on fire right now.
Yeah.
You can't pretend that's not happening, and we have to humble ourselves to the earth, and so anyway, I just think it's really important that spiritual teachers are kind of leading the way and saying, I want to get more empathetic. I want to care more about others. I want to empower other people. And so to do that, my way of doing that in this book is to just be sort of transparent about some of the relationship processes I went through, so people don't think I'm a relationship expert, because, you can ask my wife about that one.
Maybe we should interview her next. See what she thinks about that. No, I think that's actually, it's going to inform the next question, because this, everything that you teach and what you talk about in this book is about relationships with family, with romance, with friendship. And what I found really interesting and unique about this is how, just in general, how stories help give us a sense of self, or a sense of who we are, and I really love the way that happens, especially when teachers bring in their spiritual practice, or to just show us different ways in which we can become better people, to become more empathetic, more kind. So I love that. And so for you, I would imagine that you wouldn't have written this book if you didn't feel the same way. How do you think that we can bring more of that wonder into our life, where we can learn from stories like a rom-com,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's the other thing is I always get very, very confused when people say Buddhism says this, or yoga says this, or this tradition says that, because one, within any tradition, there's many different perspectives, but also if you look at any spiritual teaching, it arises in the context of a particular cultural moment, and a particular personal moment, So the cultural stories and the personal stories and having that context always is going to influence our interpretation of any so-called spiritual teaching, So, for example, with Buddhism, to understand that the reason the Buddha first talked about suffering, rather than first talking about joy, for example, is because he was talking to these, spiritual ascetics who were literally starving themselves, and he wanted to just acknowledge their struggle first, So there's an actual story behind the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. It's not just this thing that is, written on a tablet somewhere. Mm-hmm. It's there's a conversation going on, and so our pop culture kind of creates that conversation, and you could say that the way the Buddha's story is told is changes based on who's telling it. If Thich Nhat Hanh tells the story, it's actually much more a story of spiritual activism than if someone else tells the story, right?
Sure.
And so, then this moment of like, so for example, here's another, I found this really interesting, that there's a best-selling book this year, which is a really good book, written by Robert Wright, who's a evolutionary biologist and also a spiritual thinker, called Why Buddhism is True, and it's a scientific book about Buddhism, but he talks about the movie The Matrix for the first 10 pages. Uh-huh. Because he has to locate our experience within some kind of cultural narrative in order for it to make any sense at all, and we're always doing that. So the fairy tale, the fantasy story, and the rom-com, and a deconstructed fairy tale, because we don't really believe in fairy tales anymore, right. Which is one that's kind of where The Princess Bride picks up, is like it actually reconvinces a grandson who's like, romance is stupid and fairy tales are stupid, to actually believe in fairy tales again, right? So it picks up at a moment where we're like, we don't actually even believe in our own stories anymore, and reinvests us in the story, which is a very good narrative for the modern moment. And so that kind of ironic narrative, I don't think it's just my late Generation X generation, or it's the hipster generation or whatever, but that's a really good narrative to use as a starting place to look at like how we mindfully engage relationships. It's like, let's start with this. We don't believe in fairy tales anymore. So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to work with relationships in that space? So there's always a personal story and there's always a cultural story. And until you understand those two, whatever the teachings are, whatever the instructions are, they're not going to make a lot of sense,
Yeah.
And people, the other thing is people are going to feed whatever the list of teachings are, people are going to feed them through their own personal narratives and cultural narratives, right, without knowing they're doing that,
Yeah. And I think that, part of my question, just because we need to utilize these types of stories or metaphors or ways for us to relate to them in a way that we find compelling or important, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
So, what's interesting to me, especially coming from the yogic tradition and studying Tantra and studying Vedic texts, that different things are translated and, certain teachings perhaps get translated in a way that we can understand them. Do you think that we lose the depth of the meaning or of the teaching because we've translated it so much? Does that make sense? Does this question make sense?
Yeah, completely. I mean, the translator has all the power.
Yeah.
I know I don't read Sanskrit or Tibetan, but I know, at least in transliteration, a lot of the words. I remember, I speak kind of decent Spanish and, studied some complet in college. And I remember reading a book of Pablo Neruda's poetry where it was in translation. So one page was the Spanish, the other page across was the English. And they even chose to translate the same word in different places on the same page differently into English. So that person who's making that choice obviously has a lot of power, you know. And the person who chose the word suffering, for example, the one that I just used for dukkha, rather than like dissatisfaction or a feeling of offness. One, suffering is a Christian word, you know, so it's an English word, but it's a word that's used in relation to a certain Christian experience. So there's the person who's doing the translation, if they're just doing an academic translation, is going to have a lot of power. And then the other translation is we have to translate it through our experience, which means translating it through our stories, you know?
Yeah.
And then something like suffering might come alive a little bit more, and you say, oh, it doesn't mean I'm like in pain all the time. It means something feels off, or there's some sense of misalignment with my own heart or experience that needs to be worked with. And you have enough experiences through your personal stories of like what that quality of brokenheartedness or just feeling burdened in some way feels like, and that those experiences are going to come to life through our practice, and they're going to come to life through the stories we tell, you know. And so I think it's really important that a linguistic translation is a very superficial beginning of a conversation about what any body of teachings really mean.
Yeah. I mean, I find it so interesting, especially now, you know, with, again, utilizing these types of practices to begin to make sense with the madness that's happening, you know. And so I find these types of stories or these teachings to be so comforting in the fact that, we still can make a difference. We still can make a choice. We still can be the voice of understanding somebody else's perspective. It's like you were talking about being a relationship expert. And we talked about this when you were on the last time, I think, when you're like, I think you said something like, I would be wary of somebody saying they're a relationship expert, you know, because it's like, you're right. It does take two people, and I think that putting yourself in that position does make it one-sided. But I think that speaks to, you know, our ability to understand an idea, but also be able to put it into action, as opposed to just marry something and then be like, this is the way it is. You have to do it this way, or it's not going to be right. I mean, I think that's what why we are in the place that we're in, politically anyway, you know? Right.
And that's the other interesting thing is like the other extreme of this is like, you could take what I said or what we're talking about and just turn it into a total like false equivalence, like moral relativism, like no teachings really say anything, you know, it's all a matter of perspective, you know, whether you supported Trump or Hillary, like it's all even, you know, this sort of false equivalence model where there's no principles to live by, where all flaws are just subjective, and, you know, and that's not where we're taking it. We're saying that the actual principles come through by living them and come through by practicing. And so I think it's really important to develop a personal relationship, you know. I mean, you know, I talk about a night out after I was dumped and heartbroken in the chapter about emptiness and dating in the middle section of the book. You know, in one of the reviews, which was actually a really great review in the Los Angeles Review of Books, said, you know, not to, you know, gave me many compliments on my writing, and then said, you know, one quibble, like the Buddha said, you know, alcohol should be abandoned or something like that. Actually, what the Buddha said is intoxicants, and he said this in 2,600 years ago. So my tradition takes the approach, obviously, a lot of people along the path, alcohol should always be moderated, in my humble opinion. But a lot of people on the path, that is a thing to be eliminated. But when you talk about intoxicants, you can say, like, actually, intoxicants means that which you see as taking your mind away from being able to work with things compassionately and clearly. So for me, a glass of wine doesn't do that. Sometimes a glass of wine actually, one, makes me more present. 4 glasses of wine pretty much always makes me less present. But I really think if the Buddha was talking about intoxicants today, he would be talking about smartphones his number one topic. So to say, well, the Buddha said don't drink alcohol, that is a very limited cultural interpretation of a person saying, here are some of the principles you might want to apply when working with your mind, right?
Yes.
So then we could get into you could say, well, I drink, you're addicted to your smartphone. What's the difference? And the idea is that we're actually trying to be more present, and we're noticing how we escape that. And if we can tell that through our own story, that's when things start to come alive. But I'm like 100% convinced, which is too convinced. I'm 90% convinced that if the Buddha were alive today, the way he would have written the precepts would have talked about technology as an intoxicant.
Oh, I totally 100% agree. And this is literally like a topic that is never ending, this idea that we maybe have gone too far with our usage, and everything that we do on our phones, like literally our entire lives revolve around it. Like I do this occasionally where I'll take a detox, or like usually on Sundays or something, like I won't look at it at all. I won't answer anything. It's just like I don't have a phone for a day, and even that is enough for me to be able to just reset and not feel so connected to it. Or I'll just leave it. We might go like touring out, go to dinner or something, and I'll just leave my phone at home, because you don't need your phone if you're going out to dinner with your spouse or your person, unless obviously you have kids, and then that's a different story. But I find it such an interesting time that we're in with those types of intoxicants that I feel are way more toxic to our relationships than, I don't know, everything is, I guess. But I just really feel like right now having smartphones is just distracting us from living our lives,
Right.
Except go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just saying my only reason for bringing that up, because we could have a whole nother conversation about that, was that your cultural moment and your personal experience is always going to affect how you work with spiritual practices. So our story these days is really about technology in a lot of ways, and that would be part of the way that we approach any of these classic spiritual teachings has to include our modern experience.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I did want to ask you about is to maybe explain what the broader context is in the book of As You Wish.
Yeah. So the As You Wish, very famous line, right, is actually said in two relational experiences in the movie. Yeah. Which actually turns it's almost like this flip from being a fairy tale rom-com when Wesley, aka Dread Pirate Roberts, the Man in Black, farm boy, says it to Buttercup, and then it's flipped when the grandfather says it to the grandson at the end of the movie. So it's talking about the devotional aspect of true love, and we could think about that as some kind of devotional love to a spiritual path or spiritual teacher as well. But one of the things that I think is so interesting about these relationships is the notion of how commitment works in relationship. Mm-hmm. So, the first is the As You Wish of a romantic partnership. So, you might think of that as a commitment that a person chooses to make when we take on vows of partnership, like marriage, which was the way I was kind of thinking about it, as a sort of way of saying I'm going to show up, and I'm going to submit to this relationship, kind of beyond just my everyday irritations and work with my fight or flight response. So at the end of the romance chapter, the romance section, there's a chapter on marriage or marriage, to pronounce it correctly.
That's right.
And as this sort of first way of thinking about As You Wish, as a sort of like committing to a path. and then talk about it as sort of devotion to our family lineage, family relationships, which can be incredibly tough, and sometimes we feel like we were put in the wrong family, or feel very distant from our family, and other times family is completely our devotion. So that's what As You Wish meant for me. It's a really good sort of statement of real commitment and loyalty and devotion within our relationships.
Yeah, and I want to see if you can elaborate a little bit more on our enlightenment and being around our family, and why our spiritual practice just seems to be thrown out the window when we're in those situations.
Yeah. The family question, obviously, with everything I said about my family origins around the movie, was a big part for me. Yeah. That's the last section of the book, is the Dharma of family. I'm fascinated by family as a practice. Chogyam Trungpa, the founder of my tradition, said, and it's a great kind of quote, that it's possible you could become enlightened everywhere except around your family. That family could be the hardest practice, Yeah. And so I think my father said this. He might be quoting someone else, but I remember a quote that he made, and if he's quoting someone else, I apologize. But he said, the reason your family can push all your buttons is because they installed them. So there's some intimacy, there's some proximity, there's some reminder of ourselves. We work with so much self-hatred and self-aggression along these paths that the people who most remind us of ourselves often provoke that, sometimes provoke that claustrophobia, etc. Sometimes when we feel like we're part of a family, we view whatever issues arise or whatever mistakes we feel are made are amplified in our heart and mind.
Yeah.
And I think I don't think I came to any real conclusion in that section, but there was a lot of sort of thought and struggle and practice that went into it. And the notion of actually being willing to practice keeping our family in our hearts through, loving kindness meditation, through really contemplating the different aspects of our lineage, and also, then expanding that to viewing human beings as part of the same family, and which is actually true. We are actually, we are all cousins with each other. So I had the contemplation at the end of the book about what would I do if one of my cousins was Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who loves The Princess Bride. That's one of the ironic things. He's like one of the biggest fans of The Princess Bride in the world. He does amazing impressions of all the characters. I got to talk to Mandy Patinkin and Inigo Montoya, who's also a meditator, about writing my book and the movie, because he had written this op-ed piece for Time magazine when he found out that Ted Cruz loved the movie, saying that he thought Ted Cruz missed the point, how it wasn't really about revenge, how it's about true love, etc. So that notion, let's say you could have a cousin who you disagree with about so many things as much as I disagree with Ted Cruz, how would you turn your relationship with them into a practice? And I say you could just talk about the things you have in common as a human, that I would actually want to talk to Ted Cruz about The Princess Bride,
Yeah.
And just to develop a sense of shared humanity. And that's coming from another one of Chogyam Trungpa's, my favorite quotes of his, where he says, if you're having a hard time generating compassion for someone, you should contemplate that everyone loves something, even if it's only tortillas. That's the literal quote.
I love tortillas.
Right. You probably love more than that, too. We could probably connect on more than that. But if that's all we could connect on, if you kicked puppies in your sleep, which I'm not really convinced that Ted Cruz doesn't kick puppies in his sleep, but you could still connect on tortillas, right? I could still connect with him on The Princess Bride. And I think it creates a situation, I think, with family and with other difficult relationships where you learn to connect with someone, you learn to hold them in your heart, you learn to listen to them, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're empowering their view of the world,
Yeah.
You can really disagree with a member of your family and love them on a certain level, and that doesn't mean I'm going to give you what you want necessarily. You can be kind and friendly to a person like Ted Cruz and then just register people to vote for his opponent,
Yeah.
And I think that's actually the way we need to navigate the modern world is we have to disagree, but we have to also generate compassion and kindness and love. And those actually can go hand in hand. And I think that starts with the family. Sometimes we have to work things out with our family. We have to disagree. We have to proclaim our own individuality and sometimes even take space from our families. But we can do that and generate love and respect at the same time. Now, that's a lot harder the more difficult or abusive a family history might be. So I'm speaking about this in sort of an idealized case. But it is considered by my lineage like one of the hardest places to practice is within one's own family. So even knowing that, I think, generates compassion, because if you go straight from your meditation cushion or your yoga mat and then you're at a family holiday and you felt very peaceful on the cushion and then all of a sudden you feel like a basket case, it might just be because it's a harder practice,
Yeah.
Sometimes interpersonal practice is much harder than personal practice.
Yeah.
And it's okay to admit that.
Oh, that's so true. Ethan, you are literally one of my favorite people, and I am so grateful that you wrote this book and The Road Home as well, which is still one of my favorites also. So for the people those of you that are listening that didn't hear our first interview, it's going to be linked onto this particular podcast as well, so you can go back and hear that. And the links to both of his books will be on the show notes as well. I don't want to end the conversation because it's so good, but I want to respect your time. And I'm so grateful that you agreed to do this again. Hopefully you'll do it again. we can talk about
Rosie,
other topics. Go ahead.
Can I ask you one final question?
Sure.
So part of what I wanted to do with writing the Dharma, the Princess Bride, is kind of give people permission to think about the pieces of pop culture that have really influenced their spiritual lives.
Yes.
It could be a song, it could be a movie, it could be, a piece of visual art or a novel. If you were going to write your tantric and yogic and Vedic and mindful path, if you were going to write like the Dharma of Rosie's life, I'm just wondering what piece of pop culture you'd use.
Oh my goodness. That's such a good question.
All right, think about it for next time we talk.
Oh, all right. I'm going to think about it. Let me ruminate on that for a little bit. Ethan, just because I asked you before, and I ask all of my guests, obviously, Radically Loved is about us creating this community and generating support for each other and for everyone. And it's this idea that we are radically loved and radically connected, and we're completely supported by God, universe, source, emptiness, fullness, whatever higher power of your understanding. So the questions to you are, how do you feel radically loved, and what do you radically love?
Oh, yeah. Well, all of those for sure. I mean, I think I feel radically loved these days by really trying to connect with very mundane and practical things simultaneously to connecting with deeper or more mystical or more kind of like spiritual truths. And, I have to definitely say that having a daughter who's a little over 5 months old, I've never participated in anything that was simultaneously as mundane and practical, like, changing diapers and just learning the way she likes to be held at what angles and, how many minutes I have to walk her back and forth before she falls asleep at night, just like very mundane and practical. And at the same time, when I look at her, sometimes it's like staring back into the origins of the universe. And to have, a really cool little kiddo, but a situation that is simultaneously that mystical and that, kitchen sink level practical. That's my current experience of both feeling radically loved by the universe and radically loving somebody. So I hope that's a good answer.
Oh, that's a great answer. I can't wait. Next time I'm in New York, you're definitely going to see me. I can't wait to meet her and meet your sweetie and just kind of get the energy of the whole family. So do you like how I just invited myself over? That's hilarious.
It's great. It's awesome. Very awesome thing to do.
So where can people connect if they want to reach you directly? Where can they go to get more information or to tell you how much they love your book?
Yeah. So EthanNichtern.com, NICHTERN.com. EthanNichtern.com is my website, and people can get on my monthly email list. There's, I do podcasts and online Dharma talks and articles, and travel around a fair amount these days. I'm mostly based in New York at the Shambhala Center here in New York. But that would be the best way to see what's upcoming in my world, both in person and online.
Oh, that's so good. Thank you so much for doing this. I can't wait to have you on again, and you're amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosie. It's really a pleasure for me as well.
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I am so excited to continue to do this. Please share this with your friends. Email us, message us on Instagram at Rosie Acosta or on Twitter at Rosie Acosta. Subscribe on iTunes, write a review. We love doing this, so please help us continue to keep this podcast going. Thanks for listening.